Hello and welcome to another video blog from Duncanomics. My name's Duncan. You can find more of my work at duncanomics.com where I talk about ethics, technology, economics, a bit about cryptocurrency, and Christianity. I'm a Christian, so naturally this will be from a Christian perspective. But this time I want to talk about marriage. I've been thinking a lot about that lately. Is marriage all about the tax benefits or the government payments that you get so that you can raise a family? Well, I don't think so. What about rings and vows? Well, they do point to something. Love. It must be all about love, right? What about the young whippersnapper? He comes to the father and says, "Oh, I love your daughter so much. We think the same. We can't keep our hands off each other." But that marriage thing, I'm not really for me. Well, that speaks to his love, doesn't it? It says something. And I propose that's because, ultimately, marriage is a contract, or you could call it a covenant. You agreeing to share resources. And we've all heard that Bible verse from Genesis in many weddings, haven't we? Genesis 2:24 says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." And so when you get married, before you're married, you are independent. You might think differently. You might spend your money differently and act differently, make different decisions. But when you get married and sign that contract, hopefully you understand that contract, what you're doing, and I suppose there's a good spirit behind that. Because the two couples understand that. So that I actually think that's a really good view to have. I think it's healthy. Even though you're surrendering part of yourself, you make sacrifices to be in a marriage, I think you become richer through the process. And I certainly feel that way in mine. But I think lately marriage has been getting a bad rap. It seems like in the modern world, it's becoming lower and lower in importance. The idea of marriage being a cornerstone of society is sort of weak. It's been changed. Marriage, the government definition of marriage has changed, hasn't it? And I'm not a political conservative, but I would call myself a Christian conservative. That makes me a bit sad. I think it's pretty critical. But even though it has been eroded, you could say, I think it's not for the wrong reason. I think there's a good reason why it's happening, and that is simply because we are going to the government to define our contract. I mean, think of it. If marriage is a contract like we've just established, why do we do that? We don't do that for other contracts in our life. Like if I'm selling land, I might go to lawyers, and there's normally two lawyers in place, right? There's for both parties, the buyer and the seller, and it's important that there's often many warnings. Lawyers will give more warnings to the people doing the trade that you need to understand this contract. They might tweak it, that sort of thing. Or if we're selling a car, actually, car's probably a bad example because sometimes we use government registration, so we do in that case. But you don't have to, is the point. So if you weren't using government land, you wouldn't do that. Government roads. If you're just using private land, you might put in a contract, that sort of thing. But the point is, for some reason with marriage, we seem to delegate all of it to the government. And no wonder it's become really politicized, hey? Because governments, they own it. When I got married, I went to my pastor and asked him to marry us, but he ultimately had to get a marriage license from the government. And you know what? Not only that, my marriage contract is the Australian Marriage Act of 1964, and I haven't even read it. So I actually think it's a good thing not to do that. I think it's an alternative solution. I didn't invent this. It's called a privatised marriage contract. Now, if you don't know economics, don't get confused. It doesn't mean private or anything like that. It can very much be a public wedding, that sort of thing. But privatised means separate from the state. You get married separately. They're not managing that and writing that contract, just like a lot of other things we do. But it still very much can hold up in court. Governments might, be involved in that process, and actually, I would argue they shouldn't either. But that's a whole nother thing. Let's not go there. But still, very much, if you have a privatised marriage contract, it is still. There's no reason it shouldn't be valid in court. There's still bite to it. So what are we going to do about that? Well, I was thinking about that. I was thinking, well, what if I wanted to, in the rare instances when people do go out and get a privatised marriage contract, why didn't I do that? Well, I think if I went to my pastor and I said, I want to do this thing called privatised marriage contract, I think he would probably look at me a bit weird. He'd think I'm a nutter. Why do you want to do this? I do all these other weddings over here normally. Why don't you just do it like that? And let's say I could convince him. I'd then have to go to a lawyer to get that contract. If I could convince the lawyer, I'd then have to probably fork out a few grand to pay for it. So point being, there's all these barriers, isn't there? And honestly, I don't think I would have gone through with it. So what are we to do? Well, I've been thinking about this, and I actually think it's time that we take a proactive stance. And I think something like a non-profit institution that promotes this idea would be a really good idea. I think the time is really ripe, I suppose, for doing something like this. I think the world is ready. I think largely conservatives have seen how they've largely lost this battle because it's been in the hands of the government. So it's time to be proactive about it. So I think a non-profit institution could be effective in 3 ways. It would have 3 functions. And number 1 is that contract. It's important to get experts, lawyers involved so that we can write clear, sound contracts that both parties understand. It needs to be reasonably cheap if it's not free, so that it's accessible. Number 2, education. As I was saying, I think it's a bit of a weird idea to most people. So we need to promote this idea through education. And that could really happen, I think, really well through churches. Pastors could be trained and be certified, I guess, to take this, to do this privatised marriage thing through this institution. So they would do a course, and so that they could understand the whole idea, why there's a benefit of being separate from the state. And honestly, I think a lot of them would be would like the idea of having an option when the government is saying we're doing this to marriage, that they have the ability to just actually say no, thank you. I'll go over here for this other marriage contract. So there's educating pastors. But in turn, that could then be passed to the couple getting married. That pastor could, just like we have counselling, premarital counselling in a lot of churches today, which is a great thing, they could perhaps add a stream of this old idea of property rights and that sort of thing to make sure this couple understand what they're doing. Sadly, I've met too many people that haven't realised that as they've gone through. It hasn't been communicated well that this is a big deal. You are surrendering a lot of your independence. So I think that'd be really good, that they understand the spiritual side of that covenant. Number 3, I actually think screening would be really important. In some instances, couples, maybe they're not turned off, but maybe they really shouldn't get married. And pastors and this institution needs to be at liberty to say, look, I know you like this idea, it's the cultural thing to do, but we're not convinced that we're setting you up for success in your marriage. It doesn't seem, we want it to be lifelong. So they need to be able to say no in many instances. And I think with all these 3 functions, I think it could do a lot of good, to the point where I could imagine that we could see even lower divorce rates than like the state marriages. So if that's true, if we can see a lower divorce rate, I can even imagine people starting to seek out that institution. Perhaps when that young whippersnapper comes to the father and says, "I'm now ready to get married," he can now say, "Well, I'm actually I hear that, but I know that this institution over here, these Christians, they seem to be doing it a little bit differently, and it seems to be working. So if you really love my daughter, I would like you to go through them, please." And that's fantastic. So, guys, that is my pitch for this idea. But I can't do this by myself. I'm going to need a lot of help. There's still a lot of answers that I need to many questions. If this is something that you would like to contribute to, I'd really ask that you reach out to me. I'm going to need lawyers. I'm going to need pastors that have counseled people through a lot of the good times and the bad times in marriage, right? I'm going to need theologians. What does Scripture say should be in that contract? And where Scripture is silent, we're going to need wisdom. So I need a lot of help. So I'm asking you, please reach out to me. You can find my contact details at dunkenomics.com. Fill out the form. I'd like to get a list together and start the discussion and start being a bit proactive about the sad case of marriage in our society today. Anyway, that's all for me now. So thank you for your time and listening. Until next time, God bless.